Well, I'm delighted that Dr. John Suppe could join us here for a chat on the Princeton campus. Dr. Suppe, welcome to our studio.
Great, thanks, Tom.
Thank you for taking time out of your schedule. You're jetting out to California tomorrow?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Scientific work, I take it?
Yes, several things. I have to give a talk at Caltech, and then there's some meetings and
okay.
some
Wonderful.
research.
And I think that you said after that you're going to Barcelona, Spain to teach, what, in the university?
Well, no, I'm actually just doing research, working on a book,
okay.
For part of my sabbatical.
Good. Let me go ahead and add that for the background knowledge of what you've been doing, you've been at Princeton since 1971, is it?
That's right, that's right.
And have you been, what, in the geology department the whole time?
That's right,
okay.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about your background. Where did you study geology as you went through, the university system?
Well, I did grow up in Los Angeles, and I went to UC Riverside as an undergraduate, and then out to Yale as a graduate student.
Okay, so you got your doctorate at Yale.
That's right.
And then were hired to teach geology at Princeton.
That's right, that's right.
Interesting. What have been sort of your specialties, your emphases, in area of research?
Well, I'm a structural geologist. I deal with deformation in the earth, and that...
deformation. Can you explain that word?
Well, folding, earthquakes,
okay.
things like that,
okay.
Mountain building.
Okay.
We actually even work on Venus right now. We've been doing quite a bit on the history of Venus.
The history of Venus.
That's right.
That's fascinating.
That's right.
Now, I've heard a rumor that you actually are one of the authors of a very significant paper on earthquakes. It's being talked about. Could you tell us just a tidbit about that?
Well, this just came out today, I think, in Science, and it's been in the news. But we have been working on the problem of identifying these hidden faults, blind thrust faults under Los Angeles and other places. And a whole group of us, a consortium of us that have been working on this, have come out with a paper essentially identifying what we know of these hazards now. And they're actually quite a bit more substantial than people have thought. So the sort of earthquakes that we've been having the last few years are fairly typical of what you can expect in Los Angeles and other places like San Francisco.
Well, I trust that your research continues to give practical applications to maybe even predicting quakes in that area. I was sharing with a professor and some students down in Florida a couple months back that the chairman of geology, I believe at that point you were chairman of geology at Princeton. Right. I said that the chairman of geology at Princeton is a committed Christian and has a very interesting story about how that happened, sort of this pilgrimage. Would you just share with me, sort of review with me again some of the highlights of that story of how you made your pilgrimage to the Christian faith while you were here at Princeton?
Sure. I've been a geologist much longer than I've been a Christian. I became a Christian in 1978, and, right here on Princeton campus. And I did grow up in a Christian family as a child, but I didn't really understand how you became a Christian. I didn't know whether it was true or not. I was basically an agnostic. I wasn't hostile to Christianity, though I certainly realized that we're often...
I can relate to agnosticism.
Right.
I was an agnostic,
right.
too. Okay.
There's hypocrisy and things like that, and I didn't really understand, if I went to church, I didn't understand Christian jargon, and sometimes I felt that sermons were illogical, things like that, but basically I was quite open to whatever truth was out there, and I didn't know why Christianity should be true rather than some other religion. It certainly is a phenomenon that there are many different religions among humans, and so just because I grew up in LA doesn't mean that Christianity is true. And
you certainly saw a lot of religions out there.
Well,
different kinds of faith.
But basically it was, I didn't know how to find out what the truth is, and I wasn't around any Christians who could really explain to me what the truth was. And so this went on for many years. Eventually, my wife was a Christian, as a matter of fact. But I would say it was basically I had an ongoing hunger for something more to life. I've been very successful in my career, and here I am at Princeton University, and there are lots of wise and good people, but it seemed like something was missing. And so, when I'm at home, if I'm hungering for something, I start rattling around the kitchen. And so I started looking around. I went to, when I was at Yale, I would go to church some, and at Princeton, I started going to the Princeton University Chapel, and it didn't bother my sense of logic. They had very logical sermons at the chapel. But what really spoke to me and kept me coming back was something different from that. And but I kept coming, and then finally one day there was a woman preaching there in that big chapel. It's like a cathedral, and she said, "You students here, you made it to the top college, the college of your choice, and you professors, you know more about your subject than anybody else in the world, except for maybe 5 or 10 people. But you people have a kindergarten knowledge of Christianity." And that was like an arrow shot through that cathedral right into me. And that was absolutely true for me. I recognized that. And I realized that I really needed to start to look into Christianity. So I started reading books in my spare time. Eventually started to realize I really had to face up to who Jesus was.
Now, were you reading the Bible during this period? Did you actually read the Bible itself, or?
Well, I started to read really books about Christianity first, but then I realized it was really who was Jesus, because if Jesus is a wise man and a good man, I know lots of wise people around Princeton. That's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is, is there's some real significant meaning to life, and so I'd heard that the Gospel of Mark was perhaps the first gospel to be written down, so I started reading through the Gospel of Mark, and it was the first time I'd ever read through a book of the Bible as an adult, or I guess even as a child. I'd never done that. And as I read, I was obviously trying to do surgery on this, cutting away things that I was uncomfortable with, miracles and things like that. It was beyond my experience, certainly. And but overall, there was a ring of truth to it, and though if I cut away everything that I was uncomfortable with, it made no sense at all. And it was quite clear to me that from what the way Jesus acted and also what he said, as recorded in Mark, that he considered himself not to be a good and wise man, but to be God come to earth. And so that really struck me as an amazing thing that I had never really confronted before, that, maybe this is true, that, certainly the universe is a remarkable place, and to believe that it just popped into being by itself or it was created is equally as amazing stretch of faith. But so it seemed possible that God might be a loving God and might want to communicate with us in various ways, and that maybe Jesus is God come to earth. And I didn't know how you found out whether it's true or not, but for the first time in my life I really considered that and pondered that. And then later I kept going to the Princeton Chapel and started to, when I first went there I was more of an observer, but then I started to take part more and more. And I actually was taking part in a communion service one morning, and the dean of the chapel, Dean Gordon, used a liturgy, and part of that liturgy was, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, take my yoke upon you and learn of me." And to me that meant that if I took Jesus' yoke upon me, that he would reveal himself to me. So I prayed, or I felt that this was like, I'm getting sort of tangled up my words now, but I prayed, "Jesus, I don't know if you exist or not, but I'll try you out. I'll give you control of my life. I'll take your yoke upon me, and you reveal yourself to me." And I really believe that's the point at which I became a Christian. And I didn't have an understanding of sin at that point, or the atonement, or any of those things. But as I continued to read the Bible, it was a completely different situation. It was electrifying, and it suddenly all started to make sense. And within certainly a month or so, I knew that all the basic Christian doctrines were true. That's basically the way the universe is. And then since then, I've had just continuing very personal interaction with Jesus, and really
through a life of faith.
Through a life of faith.
In the context of Princeton. If a student came to you, someone or a professor, a colleague, and said, Dr. Suppe, I'm interested, I'm open to Christianity, but frankly, I'm just skeptical. What would you, if they asked for you, your main intellectual or historical reasons you think that Christianity is true, that show that it's really true, that this is reality, what would you say to them?
Well, I think it is very important to really listen to people and see what their specific concerns are. Sometimes people bring up intellectual concerns as kind of a shield and a barrier, and it is useful to deal with those, to essentially remove those defenses. But my sense is around campus that intellectual concerns are not always too strong in people becoming Christians. It wasn't a major issue for me, but it's more of a question of how you find out whether this is really true or not. And I would say that by my experience, it's really experiencing the power of God is one of the important things. And I remember one time there was a Chinese scholar who's a computer scientist was living with us in our home, and he was working on this very difficult machine language computer program, and there was some bug in it. He was very concerned about this, and he couldn't find it, and he wasn't a Christian. But one morning he was sharing with my wife and I about this again, and my wife and I decided to pray with him about this and just ask the Lord to reveal to him this error. And he came back that evening, and he was just elated and excited that he had found the bug in the program. And so that's something that you cannot consider as just an intellectual issue. This is confronting God's actions. And, around the university, we can argue any side of any question, and intellectual questions are often used in that way. And
as like a game.
Right, and it's a way of avoiding the real issues of confronting God.
What do you see to be the real issues that hinder the ordinary person from facing up to the possibility that Christ may be God coming in? In other words, is it like specific ethical, moral issues, jealousy, pettiness?
Well, I think certainly around the university there's lots of that. We have lots of bright and strong-minded people. And I think many people really do feel a need, not when they're flying high, but when they really get entangled in these sorts of conflicts, they really do start to feel that the reality of sin. They might not phrase it that way, but that's a time at which I think they're much more open to these things.
Well, in regard to the Christian faith, certainly the credibility of Christianity rests on the resurrection of Christ, and so that would be the pinnacle event that upon which we would be grounding our faith on, the death and the resurrection of Christ. A colleague or a student comes to you and says, Dr. Suppe, how can you buy the resurrection? I mean, how can you be a scientist and believe in the intervention and miraculous raising of a dead man? How would you reply to that?
Well, that would be I wouldn't give them a one-sentence reply on that.
I'm glad you wouldn't, by the way.
But it's really something that I have to work through. And I mentioned I started by reading the Gospel of Mark. I started to realize that perhaps it is possible that the universe is created, and how do we find this out? And obviously, if you were God and decided to that you wanted to interact in some way, and we were the ants, and you don't just sort of yell at the ants, but one way you might do it is to become an ant. And obviously there are liabilities in that. There's ample opportunity for confusion. You can say, well, I'm God, and I can say, well, you're crazy. And so there is a reasonableness for Jesus to be God come to earth.
Okay. I appreciate your sharing that. Dr. Suppe, as you look back over